Today's release of an update of Infrastructure Australia's report serves to underline the absolute failure and 3 wasted years of the Abbott and Turnbull governments. Infrastructure Australia went more than a year without a Chief Executive Officer. The report goes through a series of policy recommendations that we'll examine, as well as identifying 93 projects that are worthy of support. What the report highlights, though, is the need for cost-benefit analysis and proper economic decision-making when it comes to which infrastructure projects are chosen by government, and the need for proper planning. All of that has been absent from the Abbott and Turnbull years. What we know is that upon coming to government, Tony Abbott cancelled funding for construction of all public transport projects that were not already underway. So cancelled funding for the Melbourne Metro, cancelled funding for the Gawler Line electrification, and cancelled funding for the Cross River Rail projects, as well as public transport projects in Perth, both light and heavy rail. This report serves as a condemnation of those actions of the Abbott government. And now, into its 3rd year of office, we finally have a report that should have been produced 2 years ago. A report that says you need to fund public transport projects as well as road projects. A report that says you need a national freight strategy, even though one has already been produced by Infrastructure Australia in 2012, when it produced both the National Port Strategy and the National Land Freight Strategy. The problem is this government has ignored those important recommendations, just like it ignored the important work done by Infrastructure Australia on Northern Australia's infrastructure needs that was produced on its watch just last year. This is a government that has talked big about infrastructure but has failed to deliver. And when Malcolm Turnbull replaced Tony Abbott just 6 months ago, he said that he would prioritise cities. What we've seen is the dumping of the cities minister last December and a failure to replace him in the reshuffle of just last week. A downgrading to just merely a parliamentary secretary role, a failure to reinstate a major cities unit or any bureaucratic structure to support cities policy, a failure to reinstitute the Urban Policy Forum that was established by the former government, a failure to fund public transport projects in our capital cities or our major cities around the nation, with the exception of a small amount of funding for the Gold Coast Light Rail Project Stage 2 that was taken from savings that have been made on the Moreton Bay Rail Link. What we've seen from this government is 3 years of infrastructure failure. This report should be a wake-up call because it serves as a reminder of that failure. A failure to invest, a failure to have proper analysis before projects are supported, a failure to ensure that we have good public transport as well as good road projects to deal with the scourge of urban congestion in our cities. So we believe that this report should be examined and should be responded to by the government. It should be the basis of action after proper analysis, and we'll be examining all of the recommendations in this report, following as it does from previous Infrastructure Australia reports. Happy to take questions. You all right?
So, to emphasise what you've said, is this just building on previous reports that there's been a complete failure to act on this current government's standing?
Well, this is building on previous reports, but what we've seen from the government is ignoring those reports in its actions. It chose quite deliberately to cancel projects that had been approved by Infrastructure Australia, such as the Cross River Rail project, the Melbourne Metro and the Gawler Line electrification, and instead fund projects that hadn't been through proper analysis. Projects like the East-West Road project in Melbourne, that we now know had a benefit of just 45 cents for every dollar that was invested. We know that it walked away from supporting our cities. And, of course, the infrastructure portfolio remains in the hands of the National Party, who historically have been concerned simply with regional roads and not interested in what is going on in our cities. And the failure of the Turnbull government to have a cities minister for more than 2 months is quite extraordinary. It highlights that Malcolm Turnbull has been all promise and no delivery. People were quite excited by the fact that Malcolm Turnbull, when he swore in his new ministry, approved a cities minister. He said that they'd be engaged in urban policy, and instead of that, we've had no change in policy direction, and we've had a failure to appoint a minister with responsibility for cities, or to establish a structure of government such as the Major Cities Unit to recommend on these issues.
From a Sydney perspective at least, it looks like there's a huge focus, an overwhelming focus on public transport to ease congestion and to free up some of those, at least inner corridors. Is the federal government lumping too much responsibility onto the states in this setup?
No, I think it is reasonable to say, as Infrastructure Australia have, that the states and territories have not done the work that's necessary in terms of planning work. But also the Commonwealth has a responsibility to assist that process. Take high-speed rail. As Infrastructure Australia has emphasised, high-speed rail will require the cooperation of the Queensland, New South Wales, Victorian and ACT governments if there is to be a high-speed rail line down the east coast of Australia. The Commonwealth has a role in coordinating the preservation of that corridor, the proper planning today so that we can get the infrastructure that we need of tomorrow. That's why I have a high-speed rail advisory council bill or authority bill before the Parliament. A high-speed rail authority is needed to coordinate intergovernmental action to make sure that the preservation of the corridor occurs so that high-speed rail, which after all is being rolled out in Europe, in South America, North America and in Asia, can occur here in Australia, particularly in the densely populated corridor between Brisbane and Melbourne via Sydney and Canberra. This would be...
All right, we'll leave Anthony Albanese there. He's, of course, responding to the government's infrastructure announcements. And Labor, it's been long talking about the fact that the record that the government has on infrastructure isn't quite as sound as it's claimed it to be.